Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really pleased to welcome now someone who's gone on a very long plane journey, and I had an experience of speaking at a UK cancer patient conference last year, and I learnt what it was like to travel that far for the allocated time. So let me do the introduction. Dr. Craig Earle is a health services researcher and a medical oncologist, and he's currently Vice President of the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. Just for those of you who haven't mastered the app yet, I'll tell you a couple of other things. Until last year, he was the Director of Health Services Research Program for Cancer Care at Ontario and Ontario Institute for Cancer Research. He's a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Ontario. Do you want to come up while I say the last bit? And his past work includes being an Associate Professor of Medicine at the Harvard Medical School, an Associate Professor of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard School of Public Health. He has many passions in research, but they include the use of data to evaluate and improve care, particularly with a look at patients with advanced cancer towards the end of life, and also, I'm pleased to say, cancer survivors. So please welcome Dr. Craig Earle.
Thank you. Well, I guess that's my time. Thank you for that introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I came from Canada, and our countries are very similar, yours and mine in many ways. Ours is, I think we're a little bit bigger, about 37 million people, 10 million square miles. They say that Canada is all geography and no history. There's trends, geographic trends, etc. For example, when you go east to west in Canada, the people get healthier, the people get taller. So my family is from Newfoundland, there on the very east part of that. As you go west to east, though, people have more sex, so there is that. And probably the thing you need to know to put in context some of my remarks is one difference that in our healthcare system. So in Canada, healthcare is a provincial responsibility pretty much exclusively. So we don't have the split or dual system that you have here. So what that means is that when you talk about the Canadian healthcare system, you're really talking about 13 or 14 different healthcare systems depending on how you count. So until a couple of years ago, there was a TV show called Breaking Bad. I don't know if you had it here. And the premise of the show was that a high school chemistry teacher in Arizona in the US developed lung cancer but couldn't afford drugs and treatments and things like that. So he started synthesizing crystal meth and selling it in order to pay for his cancer treatments. And this led to a tweet by Will Ferrell, who said, the Canadian version of Breaking Bad is kind of lame because it ends after he gets cancer and his treatment is totally paid for by the government. So that may be the perception, but there is a reality that's slightly different. So the Canada Health Act, which is what governs healthcare across the country, actually only promises something called reasonable access to necessary care, which is the type of thing where if you think of 13 or 14 different healthcare systems, you could see that they interpret what that means fairly differently. So for example, on this slide, not wanting you to read the details, this is the policies in the different provinces for coverage for oral prescription drugs. And the point of the slide is just to say that they're all pretty different. And so that leads to a number of things. If we start thinking about cancer drugs, for example, you get differences in what's publicly funded. So for this example is bortezomib, Velcade, related to transplant. And so pre-stem cell transplant, they've pretty much all decided that it'll be covered. But post-transplant, you can see, depending on where you live, there's quite a bit of variability on what's going to be publicly reimbursed. And this leads to, of course, a lot of angst among patient populations. So this was an ombudsman's report in Ontario about 10 years ago, before Ontario started funding Avastin or bevacizumab for colorectal cancer. because the two provinces on either side, Manitoba and Quebec, were both funding it, and yet Ontario wasn't. And so the drug was Avastin. The report was called Avast Injustice. And of course, they did eventually start funding that drug. This is a study comparing Canada in general, looking at comparing Canada, and it's actually Ontario that is used as a proxy for Canada in this, with other jurisdictions. And in this study, they looked at 50 recent cancer drugs and how many of them were publicly funded. And for Canada, about 54%, so a little over half of those drugs were actually publicly funded. You'll see that Australia is very similar, just one step down at 46% in this. But you do have other countries, Finland, Sweden, et cetera, where all of the drugs were publicly funded. And so something that got me thinking about this again was coming across this article in the Journal of Clinical Oncology a few months ago, called "Can We Afford That Car?" And what it's about is CAR T-cell therapy, which you probably have heard of, but if you haven't, it's an exciting new approach to immunotherapy where the idea is they take out your T cells and in different ways engineer them so that they will fight against the cancer, and then in the lab grow up billions of these cells and reinfuse them. And very, very successful in certain areas. So refractory pediatric leukemias are being cured, intermediate grade lymphomas. Those are the two main ones now, but it's looking promising in myeloma and even some solid tumors. But the issue is that, as pointed out in this article, the charge for these, $373,000 is the price tag for this drug in US dollars. So in Canadian or Australian dollars, you can see it's around $500,000. And then there's also the associated care needed for this. For example, about 40% of people end up needing to go into the intensive care unit. So estimates come that treatment of a single patient starts to approach $1 million. And the authors here point out the price of CAR T may force a discussion of the minimal acceptable degree of efficacy that would warrant the expense. So just as recent examples, this was August 28th, in the United Kingdom, NICE, their technology assessment group, rejected CAR T as being too expensive. And then if you know anything of the story of the Cancer Medicines Fund, I think it's called, in the UK, on September 5th, that fund said that they would pay for the same drugs, at least in a pediatric setting. So all of this leads to the topic that I've chosen for this: how can we introduce innovative treatments into publicly funded healthcare systems? My system, your system. Are there ways that we can approach this? As a hint, and given that we're talking about data here, the authors of this particular article said that more equitable pay for performance strategy for oncology drugs may be one way of figuring out how we can possibly pay for these sorts of treatments. So how did we get ourselves here? Well, if you look at pretty much anything that has to do with cancer drugs and cost over time, the curve is going to look like what I've hand-drawn here. So if you look at the monthly price of new drugs as they're approved, you can see it's that sort of pattern. If you look at the price trajectory of approved drugs, this is one of the few examples in economics, I guess, where drugs actually become more expensive the longer they're available. You can look at the Ontario cancer drug budget, looks pretty similar. And the thing about this is that it's not always related to the benefits that we're getting. So this was Peter Bach's New York Times article from a few years ago looking at really, how many are there? A number of essentially interchangeable chemotherapy drugs for lung cancer. and the price for these drugs varied sixfold. This is an article that came out a few months ago in the Journal of Oncology Practice, where the authors looked at applied, you may have heard of the ASCO and ESMO value frameworks to drugs that have been approved over the last, say, 10 years or so. And what all of these 4 panels are showing in the yellow bar is the value from these value frameworks, which you see is not actually increasing on average for these drugs. And in fact, the European one would suggest that it's decreasing. But then the blue line is the cost of the new drugs as they become available. This article in JAMA Oncology that looked at 5 years of cancer drug approvals in the United States came to a conclusion that the price of cancer drugs is independent of novelty, and that there's little difference based on any sort of time-to-event analyses, and that current pricing models are not rational, but simply reflect what the market will bear. So in Canada, we've set up something called the Pan-Canadian Oncology Drug Review, and until last winter, I was part of this panel, with the idea of trying to even out some of those differences that I showed you earlier between the provinces, and at least have one review of the value and technologies and make a recommendation to the provinces about whether particular treatments should be funded. And so this group, PCODER for short, works with a deliberative framework that looks at the overall clinical benefit, alignment with patient values, which often correlates with the clinical benefit, cost effectiveness, and then the feasibility of adoption. So in terms of overall clinical benefit, what we, until recently, were usually requiring was randomized controlled trials, very high level, high quality evidence of the benefit of a drug. But increasingly, I think due to the idea of precision medicine largely, we're being faced with situations where drugs are coming forward for approval with only non-randomized data, often surrogate outcomes, so looking at things like progression-free survival or response rates even, rather than looking at actual survival, open label trials where there isn't blinding, short duration trials, very small sample sizes, often because they're targeting just a subpopulation of a particular disease site, and also increasingly indirect comparisons. And where that comes from is things are changing so quickly in cancer therapy over the last few years that when a trial starts, and maybe it's being compared to a certain standard of care, by the time the trial ends, the standard of care is different. And so as a health technology group, we're being presented with indirect comparisons of, how did the new standard come about, et cetera. So it makes it all much less clean than back in the day when we just had randomized trials compared to a standard. And so we do now have precedents in Canada for recommending drugs for funding without randomized evidence. Usually it's a very severe disease situation where there are not alternative treatment options, where a randomized trial is judged not to be feasible, either because the numbers are so small, people with a certain genetic mutation, for example, or there's a loss of equipoise. The cancer community just really no longer believes that it's ethical to do a trial with a treatment. When we see very high rates of durable, complete responses, we don't have precedents where just high response rates have led to this recommendation, but if people really go into complete response, for example, with immunotherapies, and clearly higher than expected survival at fixed points in time, 30 months or something like that. And especially if it's a situation where there's good quality of life, low toxicity of the treatment. In terms of cost effectiveness, we always say that we don't have an explicit threshold. Now, NICE, for example, does have an explicit threshold. We say we don't. We look at the evidence and make judgments. But the reality is that some economics researchers in Canada looked at the decisions that we'd made over a number of years and back calculated that there is evidence that we really judge around $140,000 per quality adjusted life year as a cost effectiveness threshold for recommending something for approval. And of course, people have started to do cost effectiveness analyses of CAR T therapy. And because they're very effective, and particularly very effective, curing leukemia in young children, they have been found to be cost effective or potentially cost effective. Now, if they start to be found effective in the common cancers that affect old people, that calculus may change. And when we consider feasibility of adoption, in reality, usually what we've been looking at is the budget impact. Can we possibly afford to pay for all of this expensive treatment for patients? But it can also mean the human resources, facility infrastructure, et cetera, necessary. So there have been treatments coming along where people have had to be hospitalized for a month and various things like this. And when we think about CAR T, that certainly is an issue, because not every center has the expertise, we think, to be able to give CAR T therapy. There's, as I mentioned, a requirement for, a lot of people end up needing to be in the intensive care unit. If we really were to wait for all of the evidence for some of these treatments to be in, we'd find ourselves behind the eight ball. It actually takes several years to develop the infrastructure necessary to adopt some of the new treatments. When we look at a budget impact assessment, the type of thing that we're usually looking at are how many patients are we talking about here. If it's pediatric leukemia, okay, we can probably afford that, but myeloma might be a challenge if that's coming up. What's the likely uptake? What proportion of patients are going to use this new therapy? How long will they be on treatment? Big question for a lot of these immunotherapies where people are on for 2 years and things like that. What's the cost of providing the treatment in other ways? Do you need to do genomic testing? Do you need central venous access devices, ICU facilities, et cetera? What's the patent situation? Are we just trying to get over a hump for a few years and then we expect the price to come down? And are there offsets? Are there other savings in other sorts of things? So, for example, the pediatric leukemia example, when you talk to different pediatric oncologists, will this replace bone marrow transplant or be used in transplant refractory settings, et cetera? And are there downstream effects on the treatment algorithm? So is the new treatment going to be in addition to what you're currently paying for, or will it actually replace other things? And how are other jurisdictions possibly managing with this? So, one of the first things that you need to know in order to do a budget impact assessment is, what does the drug really cost? And the reality is that almost no one knows in most situations. These are deals that are made with payers, with jurisdictions, and are kept very much secret. So price negotiations, I know in a lot of jurisdictions, and certainly in Canada, the general approach is what's called value-based pricing, where you try to come up with some estimate of the quality adjusted life years that will be gained from this treatment, and then target in your negotiations a price that would render it cost effective, at least as a starting point. And so I know in my experience with P-Coder, often the things that the manufacturers would be coming back and quibbling about the most was the assessment of the cost effectiveness analysis that was done, because they know that that's where the price negotiations are going to start. So what do we do when innovation outpaces evidence? How do we rigorously evaluate treatments, but also provide access to patients in a timely manner, especially in these situations where at the time you're having to make the decision, there's pretty great uncertainty about the clinical benefits and also about the financial aspects of the treatment. And these can be very high-stakes situations, especially when there's a very high per-patient cost, like CAR-T, or large patient numbers, think of immunotherapies now in lung cancer, and likely indication creep, meaning that once it's funded for some situation, even if you have some sort of control mechanism in terms of the patient population that's supposed to be getting the drug, we know that there's ways of gaming that sort of thing and getting the treatment to be funded for other patients. So in other words, the patient numbers will go up. And so one approach to this, and an approach that Australia is actually very much a world leader in, is managed entry agreements. Or if you start looking at the literature on this, I've got lists of the words that you'll see, and this can basically be sort of a Mad Libs type of thing. You'll see performance-based access schemes or adaptive entry arrangements. You'll see pretty much any combination of these sorts of words, but they're all referring to some sort of an arrangement between a manufacturer and a payer to enable coverage subject to specific conditions that address the uncertainty, whether it's clinical effectiveness or the budget implications of a funding decision. And there are many different types of these managed entry agreements, and they basically are divided into two types: health outcomes-based ones, so ones that have to do with actually the effectiveness of the treatment. So that would be the idea of pay for results. And that can take many forms, but one is the idea of free drug initiation and then only paying if there's some evidence of benefit. So, for example, one of the Alzheimer's drugs in Italy is free until an assessment at 3 months, and as long as the patient is at least stable, then the public payer will start paying for it. Coverage with evidence development, so paying for coverage, but then often prospectively there'll be some sort of collection of data to try to reduce the uncertainty that I've been talking about. Financing disease management programs, so the one that I think about, I'm a GI oncologist, so we use the EGFR inhibitors that cause a acne-like rash, and so in the clinic there are all these packets of creams and information that you just are able to hand to patients, financed by the drug company that makes the drug as part of one of the managed entry agreements. And of course, providing additional trial data as it becomes available. So some sort of recognition that as soon as you know how this trial that's midway through is starting to look, that we need to know about that. But then there are also a lot that actually have nothing to do with the outcomes and are really about controlling the financial uncertainty. And so the biggest one of these is just a volume discount. And this is what the whole idea behind P-Coder. It wasn't, unbelievably, prior to 2012 in Canada, it really was every province negotiating with drug companies. So little Prince Edward Island or whatever, negotiating with the sharks. And so in 2012, we at least started to all get together and negotiate as a country. But there are also lots of these that have to do with utilization reviews. So some sort of a cap or a discount if the overall budget impact is exceeded, if the per patient cost is exceeded. An example of that was in the United States with bevacizumab, where they actually offered the drug once $50,000 was accrued in a year for a patient, the drug became free. Unfortunately, there was very little uptake of that because if you know about how oncology payment works in the United States, they get paid based on a markup of the drug. Or if the per patient volume is exceeded. But by far and away, the most common of these is the volume discount. And the word on the street, even though no one knows, is that since 2012, when the provinces have all got together to negotiate, that a lot of these more creative ones have actually become less common because it's more difficult to make these sort of arrangements for 13 different healthcare systems, and now it's working mostly on volume discount sort of basis. So why would manufacturers agree to this sort of thing? Well, it beats a denial of coverage outright. It beats having an explicitly reduced price, because these sorts of things do keep the real price confidential. And of course, they have hope for indication creep once the drug is available. But the idea is, what if we made all of our product listing agreements conditional? This is a way to balance access with the need to evaluate information. And it leads to the idea of iteratively looking at and generating evidence to reduce the uncertainty. So for example, committing that at some sort of point of time in the future, 1 to 3 years, that you could analyze routine collected data to see if the assumptions about costs or effectiveness have actually been borne out. Now, in Australia, these sorts of product listing agreements are very common. The problem is, in every jurisdiction, this follow-up part, that the actual going back, looking at the data, and then doing something about it, the follow-through is something that's been missing. But the idea is we would need to reserve the option to either renegotiate the price at that time, revise eligibility criteria, amend the conditional listing scheme, or to delist the drug. And so this sort of approach really would move from a one-off decision to more of an ongoing process. Now, what sort of things could you realistically assess if you were trying to revisit this? Everyone wants to go back and look and see how effective was it, but as you know, observational evaluations are often limited by things like patient selection. The 80-year-olds with comorbidity are not the same as the people who are on the clinical trials. The intervention fidelity, so is the treatment really being applied as rigorously as they were in the trials? And then ascertainment of outcomes. So, we don't actually capture in a rigorous way whether people have responded to treatment or what the criteria for progression are. But in many cases, we could look at quite a few things. So major toxicities, complication rates definitely are possible. The duration of treatment can serve as a proxy for progression-free survival. Any of the assumptions really underlying the budget impact assessment can be assessed. And if there is some sort of uncertainty, then you could consider randomized evaluation as a condition of listing. We actually made a suggestion around the immunotherapies, because there is a question about whether they really need to be given for 2 years, and maybe 1 year is enough, something like this. And so PCODER made a suggestion to the provinces that the condition of funding these would be that randomly patients could be assigned to the full 2 years versus maybe 1 year. And in fact, this would be something that would move forward the science with these treatments. But I think when they started looking politically at what something like that would look like, they did not go for it. But this is all the type of thing that, when people talk about real-world evidence, this is the type of thing that we could do. Now, the requirements for this is that you do need good data. You do need a good sample size. You need very transparent and rigorous analyses with pre-specified thresholds and consequences. If the uptake, utilization, or certain outcomes are not this is what will do to the price or delist, et cetera, and come to an agreement of facts a priori with the manufacturers of what the definition of success would be. And we have to realize that this may sometimes actually suggest a price increase down the road. We'd have to consider making the same data available to the manufacturer, because they have a lot to lose here. The results of such an evaluation could affect prices in larger markets. There has to be resources for evaluation. So this is the problem. The evidence generation type of things that we've set up in Ontario, 3 years later, there really is no capacity, and it's been people, often researchers coming in, working off the corner of their desk to do these evaluations. And then education and communication with the public that changes could happen. This drug that was available a year ago now is no longer publicly funded. And there may need to be some sort of facilitation around how you handle defunded drugs. And then you could evaluate the evaluations. What's the value of this sort of information? What works and doesn't work in terms of these types of agreements? I'm pounding through because getting towards the end of time. So for CAR T cells, going back to that initial article, the type of thing that has been suggested, Novartis, the manufacturer, has suggested that if there's not a response within 30 days, that the treatment would be free. But they know that 82% of patients will actually respond in that time frame. So the authors in this case proposed that maybe we need to look at something like people still being in complete remission a year later. So this is just raising some of the issues around how we can introduce innovative treatments into our publicly funded healthcare systems. And I think that part of the answer could be creative reimbursement approaches, but it requires us increasing our capacity to collect and analyze real world data. So both the access to the data, the quality of the data, and investing in the ability to follow through and do analyses. I think randomized implementation, if there are key questions to be answered, is something that I wish or I hope can be considered. And then it is something that will take socialization with the public. Just the idea that we have a defined basket of goods in the public healthcare system that we have to manage responsibly. I think, unfortunately, at least in Canada, until people get sick, they don't realize that. And they do really going back to the earlier slide, think that everything is completely free when it's not. And so I'll end there and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And could I ask, just before I open to question, Professor David Currow, Professor Karen Canfield, Professor David Roeder and Scott McLaughlin to come and take a place on the stage, because we're going to be segueing shortly into an interactive panel discussion on the use of data to shape our health system. Could I just make a quick comment and then open to the floor? Actually, no, I won't. Do we have a question or a comment for Dr. Earle from his presentation? And I will run to you with surprising speed. Anyone with a question or a comment relating to that presentation? Thank you. And do you mind just saying your name and where you're from? I'll hold the mic. I don't let it go.
Sure.
No, I don't let it go.
No.
So I'll hold it.
Okay. Sorry, so I'm Nimrat Hassami. I'm a clinician and a public health physician from the university.
It has to be close for volume. This is all being recorded. So just trust me that I know what I'm doing.
Okay. So I just want to thank you for the fantastic talk. And I know there are people on the panel who are experts in screening. I work in screening and my research is in breast screening. And I think that the model you presented about drugs may sound like it's something that's not applicable for screening technology, but in fact it is. And embedding screening studies and new technologies, new testing in screening also can use that model. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any other question or comment for Dr. Earle? Can you yell if I don't see you and you've got your hand up? You certainly can. Let me introduce Professor David Roeder from South Australia, and it's on, and you can go for it.
Yeah, look, great presentation.
Close to your mouth there.
I just want to comment on the need for good data. I don't want to make a bid for bad data, but sometimes if we live in a world of trials and research, what is good is a very high level. When we're looking at population-wide data and linking administrative data, we have to put up with some imperfections, putting it mildly. So the data, I would say, have to be good enough to move us in the right direction. That's a comment, really, more than a question, but I'd appreciate your reaction to it.
Sure. So very true. Can't argue with what you said. We've certainly had a philosophy, at least in Ontario, of let's just use the data that we have, and if there are flaws, that'll actually prompt an improvement in the data. And we have seen that in several different situations, that by going out and saying, so here's what our data is telling us about your practice or about the effectiveness of this drug or things like that, it has made changes in the way data are recorded. A lot of times if it doesn't affect how much you get paid, you don't really care what it is. But if it starts affecting other things in the system, like your access to treatments or how the quality of your care is being reported, then all of a sudden there becomes a big push from your cancer center administration or whatever to pay some attention to this. And so by putting it out there, even if it's maybe not quite good enough, it leads to an improvement in the data.
I might ask a question, and then I'll transit to the panel discussion, which is next. I suppose as I was listening to you, there were two issues in my mind. First was a memory, and that is about 6 weeks ago, I was at the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre in Melbourne with the Minister for Health, Greg Hunt. He is still the Minister for Health, isn't he? It's just been so turbulent in Canberra, I thought, have I missed a redistribution? But he is. And I was there because I'm a survivor of HPV-related oropharyngeal cancer. And another man was there who's also a survivor, who's lost most of what's below his nose, including his tongue, but with the brilliant work of a speech pathologist. Any speech pathologists in the room? Thank you for all your work. Hand up if you're in allied health. Welcome. Hand up if you're nurses. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hand up if you are a medical practitioner of any kind. Thank you and welcome. Hand up if you're in research. Thank you. Hand up if you're in policy, policy development. Thank you very much. And what about primary health networks or general practice? Okay, thank you. Welcome to you. Have Aboriginal Medical Service? Welcome again. If I missed anybody, yell at me so that you don't feel insulted.
Consumers.
Us. Hand up if you're you're all patients, of course, but someone who's involved in patient advocacy. Big, big welcome. So please feel free for questions or comments as we go. But coming back to my man, a speech pathologist had helped him to speak without a tongue, which was pretty impressive. And when the health minister got to us in this lineup, because he'd just put an immunotherapy drug on our pharmaceutical benefit scheme, this man with so little of his face left was on that immunotherapy drug. So why am I telling you this anecdote? When I hear that expression, what was it? Quality adjusted life years, I'm assuming that means how much more time people get with a reasonable quality of life. And this man was still working, running a business, paying taxes. And, what's a life worth? And they lobby politicians, and I guess that's why we have a Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme Advisory Committee as a barrier to the minister being influenced by the tongueless man. But the question is, are there patients involved in this process of this difficult decision-making, rather than us just being briefed on the impact on us if we're an individual patient? Is there any public role in this?
So, it was with hesitation that I took out the slide on the patient part of that quadrant, because I suspected this might happen. But I actually think that it's a moving target and it's something that's evolving. But at least in our process, I think we do have a reasonable form of input. So we do have a number of patient representatives who are on the panel. They're voting members, just like I am. And we work with patient advocacy organizations they make submissions just like the manufacturers do. And one of the things that has been in evolution over the last 5 years or so is that we've actually been working with those organizations to help them survey members, and not just in Canada. So, for example, what we're often looking for is the experience with the particular drug that we're interested in. And so that may mean that it's patients in Australia or the United States, but there's usually networks. So people who have been on trials with those drugs and trying to target them to see what is the experience on the drug, as well as, and this is something that I would say has been the most influential in some cases, really getting a sense, even as a medical oncologist, we don't always have the sense of what it means to, come in every day and have, these sorts of treatments and what the fatigue is really like, et cetera. So getting the input and getting fairly rigorous input that is considered as part of that deliberative framework for these treatments. So I know sometimes there are issues of tokenism, or they're part of the committee but they don't vote, and all of these sorts of things. I think we've taken a real approach of making it one of the 4 considerations, and patients very actively involved. So
Look,
I'm
thank
sure
you
we can improve even more. But
I know. Look, thank you, Doctor. Would you give him a warm round of applause? And if you could join the panel. And could I just ask David, just before we begin the panel, if you could grab a microphone? I don't know about patient participation in the pharmaceutical benefit scheme process. Do you know?
I think there are probably some better qualified people to talk about that, but the pharmaceutical benefit scheme is a very broad church and has excellent input from both clinicians and the community more broadly. As Craig pointed out a little earlier, this is about really ensuring that there is cost-effectiveness data compared to current treatment, and I think that comparison is an important part of understanding how decisions are made nationally in a very difficult setting.
Because it's a kind of health literacy, isn't it? I mean, I've sat at tables with women with ovarian cancer diagnoses seriously discussing whether to mortgage their house in order to get another round of treatment because something's not on the PBS. Karen, are you able to give insight into the role of patients in the PBS? It doesn't matter if you can't, I was just wondering. This is Professor Karen Canfill, the Director of Cancer Research at Cancer Council New South Wales.
Thanks, Julie. So I've had more direct experience with the MBS and the Medical Services Advisory Committee, and certainly, as David alluded to, I mean, the consumer representation is right through the process. So consumers are very much sitting at the table where these decisions and evaluations are discussed. I think that's really key. Mm-hmm.